Thank you, Barbara. I'm Deborah Collyar with Patient Advocates in Research, and you're going to hear a lot of the same themes, I think, from both of us. And Barbara and I have worked together. I was a part of the aggregate return of results and the individual return of results that MRCT has been a part of. So a lot of these themes carry through much of the work. I thought, based on what I was asked to do, that I would give you a more kind of real-world approach from a patient perspective on what it's like to be involved or think about clinical trials. And so the title here, you'll see, is actually bigger than most of my titles, but that's because we really need, and I'm very happy to be here. I appreciate being asked to present, because I think I'm asking the HL Roundtable to help us with messages that many of us have been trying to relay within clinical trials for over 20 years, to get more acceleration of real life information to people that they need at the time that they need it throughout the process of their diagnosis, treatments, and clinical trial considerations. So I think we can do a lot to make clinical trials better for and with people and patients, because all of those words are actually important. So hopefully I will help explain a little bit of that. So in the U.S. health crisis system, because that's actually what we have rather than a care system, people are people, right? Each individual is the same person that they've always been 2 minutes before their diagnosis, but then they're relabeled into a patient as soon as they're diagnosed with a medical condition or illness. And the more serious that is, the more acute that difference becomes. So from a patient's perspective, it's like being catapulted onto a different planet without a roadmap, a dictionary, or any type of survival training. So you feel totally alone, and you feel ill-equipped for what you're about to hear. The other thing that I think is really important is that when you are first diagnosed with an illness or a disease, your body puts you into physiological shock, and that's actually been studied and proven. So it's the strangest thing to be hearing sound, focusing, you see people's lips moving, you're focusing more than you have ever focused in your life, and stuff just goes this way, off the chart. And it's not because anyone is inept or uneducated or whatever. The body actually is trying to protect them. And so one of the ways that I try to describe that is, for those of you that are old enough to remember Lost in Space, you remember that robot? Says, "Danger, danger, Will Robinson." That's kind of what's going on in your head when you get a diagnosis of cancer or something like that. So that's why we always tell people to try to bring another person with them, or certainly record when they can conversations, because then they can listen to it, their loved ones can listen to it later and actually try to understand more. So the more we can help them in that situation, the better. The more we can help the healthcare providers in that situation, the better. And it's not to give them a medical literature piece. That doesn't do any good. It actually doesn't do any good once the shock wears off either, because that has too many terms that people don't understand. You see there on the side, that's a pretty average looking clinic, right? Of what people deal with. And it looks kind of chaotic, but that's what people are kind of used to. The other thing that's really important to understand is when someone is finally diagnosed with their final illness or condition, they've probably gone through many different medical providers, many different subspecialties, sometimes different diagnoses that were not correct. And they may have even been treated for something other than what they had. That happens a lot. And so the way, and I work a lot in the cancer world, so the way I describe it when I'm speaking to oncologists is you have to remember that your office, the oncology office, is the last place the patient ends up. It's not the first. It's not the only. So how many different messages has that person gotten through the medical system that could have been wrong, could have been confusing, could have built mistrust. There's all sorts of things along the way. So I've always had a belief that there are ways for us to be planting seeds about clinical research and clinical trials throughout the path that the patient has to walk, and give them different messages along that path that make sense to them, so that if they are diagnosed and we want them to consider a clinical trial, they have a better understanding of why we would even be talking to them about that. So misdiagnosis is one. There is confusion. We talked a little bit about, or we haven't yet, but big data is something I'm sure everyone in this room has heard about, probably dealt with, probably presented in different meetings with, and been involved with data scientists. Part of the issue with this is that big data, while the promise is great, and believe me, I have a computer background, so I believe in data. I believe in data sharing. But the problem is the way that we're approaching this for patients is that people are beginning to feel like they're a data repository rather than a person who has this illness and is a partner with us in this. So we continue to try to take from patients without giving back things that they need. And so this is a large part of what you may wonder, well, what the heck does that have to do with health literacy, Deb? Well, it has a lot to do with health literacy. Because if you want people to pay attention to what we're interested in and have them actually consider the treatments that they need to take in the clinical trials, then they need to understand what their role is in all of that and why that's important to them. So how many of you have ever heard of WIFM? Okay. What's in it for me? Okay, you have to excuse my background. I have the M word, marketing background, and I've been in management and operations and training and strategic planning and all that stuff. So I bring all of that with me. I'm actually trying to start coining the term WIFIP, right? What's in it for patients or people? That's the way the research community needs to be thinking about this, because we're pretty good at putting our own interests there first, not what people's interests are and patients' interests. So that's where we need to go. There are also costs, and of course we talk about the costs of drugs nowadays, which are totally astronomical and out of reach for a lot of people. I have a lot of people ask me a question I have a very hard time answering, and that's, Deb, why would I want to support research when all they do is produce drugs nobody can afford? You know, we need to be talking about that more openly and involved. But there are many costs involved for a patient. There's a cost to their family. There's a cost to their work situation. There's a cost to their social situations. Sometimes there's stigma involved. In fact, more often than you may think. So there are lots of different kinds of costs that enter into a person's ability to handle their illness, their disease, their medical visits that need to be in there. And then there's the word clinical trials. Now, a lot of times people will say, oh, there's only 3 to 5% of patients who enroll in clinical trials, or especially for cancers and things like that. And then we kind of blame the patients for that because they're not really interested in clinical trials. Studies have shown that people are interested in clinical research. They're willing to look at it as a part of their decision-making process. But very few of them are actually going to a doctor who does clinical trials. That's a large part of our problem. The other part of our problem is the eligibility of clinical trials, and the ones that exist, we don't have a clinical trial for every patient. We think about patients for the clinical trials that we have. What we don't think about is, where is a clinical trial for every patient? And if we truly mean words like patient engagement and patient centricity and all of that stuff, all the latest buzzwords, then we actually have to start thinking about the way we conduct clinical research much differently. So, I talked a little bit about what it's like to be a patient. This is the kind of stuff, as I said, when you're going through shock, that you get all of these kinds of terms and all of these kinds of new concepts that are thrown at you in a very short period of time, usually in one discussion, sometimes more than one, by your healthcare provider, whether it's the doctor, the nurse, or everyone involved. And you've got all sorts of terminology that you're wondering, what does that mean, first of all, at all? What does it mean to me? What does it mean to me in this particular situation that I'm now facing? And then how do I deal with that? Where do I put that? How do I fit that into my life? Is this something, how does this affect my family? How does this affect my work? Am I going to lose my job and therefore my means to be able to pay for my treatment, et cetera? So those kinds of things are very important. So I've, for years, put together Words Matter, and I have a whole one on clinical research that I did not put up here. If you see this, these are like pretty normal things that we talk about in doctors' offices. This doesn't have to be related to clinical trials. And actually, I'll explain in a minute, we've put together lexicons for clinical trial terms as well. But if you look at this for a minute, you see a negative test, right? When you go to a doctor's office and you get blood work or whatever, and you get a negative test, is that good or bad? Seriously, is that good or bad? If you take a pregnancy test, ladies, right, and you want to get pregnant, is that good or bad? If you don't want to get pregnant, is that good or bad, right? I mean, we have to think about that. A positive test, when is that good and when is that bad? Many of our tests don't really tell you, they don't give you the context that you need for what that means, okay? And then there's the C word, which to me is not cancer, it's cure. We use that way too often. It doesn't mean what people think it means. And we need to stop using it until it does mean, oh, good, I'm never going to have to worry about this thing again. I put tumor mutation burden in there. How many of you have heard that term? Okay, not everybody, okay. That's something that's really important in immunotherapies, and I'm going to explain that in a moment as well. So this just kind of gives you an idea of how people think about this differently than the way science and medicine feels about it. So what people really want is they want better treatment than what exists today. That's why we do clinical research. That's what we tell them. That's what everybody thinks. But they want answers. They want better, not just more. And often what we're producing nowadays, especially in cancers, is more treatment that nobody still quite knows how to use well, okay? And what they really want, the second sentence there is for my metastatic friends. Metastatic cancer patients want something that's going to work for them. They don't want to be used as a surrogate for earlier stage patients anymore. They have their own needs and issues that need to be addressed that are rarely ever addressed in clinical trials. And so that's an example of one of the things that we need to change. I'm putting immunotherapy in here. I've actually worked with the immunotherapy community now for over 8 years as a patient advocate. And one of the terms that we coined years ago is the latest greatest, right? Whatever the latest greatest in science is the new hope, the new answer. All we need to do is get that, and then everything is going to be okay, right? Because that's kind of the way it's presented to the public. And therefore, we create more mistrust when they figure out, oops, that didn't quite work the way everybody said it was going to work. So there is great promise in immunotherapies. They are helping a lot of people, but it's still a minority of cancer patients now that are being helped by immunotherapies. We need to be setting expectations correctly and properly here for everyone in the system so that we don't oversell this and overhype it. A lot of tumors don't respond. We're now talking about using immunotherapy in addition to the surgery, radiation, chemo that people get. The combinations aren't just combinations in immunotherapy, it's also with the existing therapies. So it's just adding another layer of treatment on top of everything that can be very effective. But we need to think about what kind of message does the public have? Why are people going to their oncologists and saying, I need immunotherapy when they're diagnosed with cancer, when they know nothing about it, and they're usually not even eligible for it because there is a minority of patients. So that's a very important part of the whole thing. And so what people and patients really want from immunotherapy is realism. What we really need as patients, you're never going to take away hope, but we need to stop hyping everything. And a lot of medical literature and a lot of the way people now explain treatments and stuff to patients is filled with hype. And we've got to get rid of that. There are better ways to do that. So we can explain what people really want. We also want, of course, fewer side effects, right? That's what the IRAEs is, the immunotherapy adverse events. There are fewer people that get side effects from immunotherapy. That's a good thing compared to chemotherapy. But when they get them, man, they are horrible, and people can die from them. So we really do need, again, to talk about this realistically so that someone understands your chances of getting adverse events from this may be less. But if you get them, this is what we're going to do about it because it's really serious. So those are things that are important. And there's all sorts of research being done on this to find out why certain people get side effects and why others don't. What we really want is to have information, again, in context. People are used to chemotherapy, hearing about chemotherapy, knowing about the side effects of chemotherapy. What we don't do right now is compare immunotherapy well with the other treatments that people will get, like chemotherapy or radiation and things like that. So they need, again, comparable notes on that. When we talk about duration of response, that's a big one in immunotherapy because there are better durations of response. Response itself in a clinical trial is kind of a misnomer when you think about it from a patient standpoint. We're talking about partial responses and complete responses. When someone hears that they've had a complete response from their cancer treatment, they think they're done, right? They don't think that that's for a 3-month period or for a 6-month period or whatever. We have to do a better job of explaining what that actually means, what we're talking about. The financial toxicities are in there. And then, of course, quality of life and patient-reported outcomes, PROs, are things that aren't really talked about much at all in the immunotherapy world. They're kind of repeating a lot of the mistakes that have been made in clinical research all along. And we need to stop that, right? This is a new field. There are new opportunities for how we can actually explain this to people and work with people better together. So again, if you don't remember anything else of what I said, please remember this one word, context, right? That's what we need for people. I'm going to go through this part very, very briefly. But many of us have been involved in clinical research for years. And we do that because we can help in a lot of these areas that can help sponsors do a better job of creating clinical trials and also getting better results from clinical trials for everyone, and especially for patients. So we're involved in concept and protocol design in the development process of treatment. And feasibility and is a big part of that. We not only help with that, but we help them understand how to actually identify and help solve some of the issues that patients have, not just for the scientific compound itself. In recruitment plans, we definitely have been involved in those. We've been involved with regulators and with IRBs, with communities, to help explain what clinical research is and why they might want to consider that if they're ever in a situation where they might need it. And of course, the plain language summaries, which is a much better term than lay summaries, which I'll mention here in a minute, to give people the information that they need. So this is an example of one of the things that many of us have been a part of, and Phyllis and Patty are involved in this as well. But CALGB, Cancer and Leukemia Group B, was one of the 11 groups that NCI funded for clinical trials. They've now merged together into what's called the Alliance for Clinical Trials in Oncology, one of 4 groups. We used to have a committee we called CARE. It was the Committee on Advocacy, Research Communication, Ethics, and Disparities. And the people that were a part of this committee were a part of someone who played a role throughout the clinical trial process. So we had patient advocates, we had investigators, we had nurses, we had data managers, statisticians, protocol writers, the whole gamut there together. It was a very pragmatic committee that looked at what are the issues throughout the process from development, approval, activation of a clinical trial, recruitment. Oops, what's this word? You guys talk about retention and adherence and compliance. From a patient standpoint, it's an endurance test. That's the way people think about it. And that's not just for clinical research, that's for their treatment, right? That's the issue that they have. So again, if we're thinking about this more from a patient standpoint, we need to think about it from their perspective. So you'll see a lot of stuff here I'm not going to go into. There is a lexicon, as I mentioned before, for clinical trial language and then trying to explain that better to people. We also were some of the first ones that were focused on giving people results of the research that was done in this group. And we started that in the late 90s, doing research with providers and with patients to see what was important to them. I'm bringing this up because I'm going to ask you which statement is correct, and there's a purpose for this, believe me or not. There's a statement A and a statement B. Which statement is actually correct? B. Okay, thank you. Whew, that was a close one. B is correct, and yet I'm bringing this up because this is a perfect example of how we need to change the mindset of research and medicine, because we continue to blame patients for failing their treatment when in fact it's the other way around. Treatments fail patients. And so this is more than a semantic exercise. And that's one of my messages too, is we actually have to rethink the way that we're doing this and the way that we approach medicine and clinical trials if we want to make an impact in how people feel about that. And informed consent, as Barbara said, is just one area that we won't discuss a whole lot of. But when you look at the words, you know, just because it's in the regulation doesn't mean we have to use it. And I appreciate Barbara's comments that she doesn't use that because too many people do. Patients and people hear that as a verb, not as a noun. Okay? And if you think about that, who wants to be subjected to anything, right? So that's where a lot of the issues come from, is the kind of language that we've used and the kind of mental approach that we've used with patients before, so that they feel defensive about their role in all of this. People really do want to know, this thing about being alone is a big deal in the patient world. When you're first diagnosed with something, you feel like you are alone. And so being able to help them understand that they aren't, and that there are other people that have gone before them to learn about research is important. What are we doing, and why are we doing it, and what should they expect? And if there's a problem, what's their safe word to get out of that clinical trial? All of those things are really important. And then what's really important to them is what's going to happen to me after that clinical trial or after I withdraw. That's critical because they still have to live with that disease, even if that trial is over. So those are important things. The ongoing communication is really key. Trial summaries, I was asked to bring this up. Obviously, I'm taking too much time here, but I've seen this, these same kind of things in many presentations. Usually the sponsors are putting this part first, right? Instead of what's in it for the trial participant and the public. We need to share what was learned. We told them we would tell them important things that were happening in that clinical trial when they signed the informed consent. That's in every informed consent. They're going to hear about important things about that trial, and yet we don't share the results of the study that they participated and contributed to. I don't understand why. So, these are important. And oh yeah, they're also important because we now have a regulation from EMA, thank goodness. And that's forcing everybody to pay more attention to this. But that doesn't mean that's why we're doing it. We have an opportunity to actually influence the field and make this happen in a way that's going to be better for patients. And that's why the plain language summaries are so important. And while we're talking about that, in the EMA regulations, they do use the word lay summaries. I've looked this up in the dictionary. There are 14 different definitions for lay, and none of them are non-scientist. Some of them are derogatory as well. And so we need better words, and there's no reason why we can't say this is a public trial result. This is a plain language if that's what we want, although that's just one portion of what health literacy is. These are just a couple more examples of things that are important that are a part of the clinical research process. Treatment switching or crossover designs in clinical trials are actually really important to the patient communities. It's important for them when they're considering clinical trials. What that means is if they're assigned to a randomized study on arm number 1 and instead of arm number 2, and their cancer comes back or their disease or whatever, they can actually switch onto the other arm. Okay, there are ways to do this statistically, and on this study, there was a statistician from the UK that was there that is a part of NICE, and he actually has all of that in there. There are ways to do this. This is actually a white paper that's been designed to show that, and we need to get the word out about these kinds of things. These are the different kinds of ways that we need to rethink clinical trials. Having clinical use in mind. How would people actually use this drug? Not just the scientific aspects of it, to rethink the way that phases and designs are done, and thank goodness that's starting to happen, but it's not happening fast enough. Patient-reported outcomes are much more than just adverse events, and yet that's kind of how they got started, and we need them to move forward into presenting more of what is involved from a patient standpoint. And then it's really important to know with the shorter FDA approval cycles that are going on now in clinical research, there are many more questions that are left unanswered. And we have to figure out a good way of answering those questions even after the drug is commercially available now. So what are the long-term impacts of it? What kind of issues and regimens are the best? Which populations does this work in? Which subtypes of diseases benefit from this versus another one? All of those things are still really important. Conditional approvals, I think, will become more important, and that means that the information that we give to people, REMS is, I forget exactly what that stands for. It's Risk Evaluation and Monitoring System. Thank you, thank you. Okay, so that's becoming a bigger thing. A lot of the newer drugs that are approved have REMS automatically built into them. We need to do a better job of giving people information about that. And then, real-world data is there. Hopefully that will turn into real-world evidence, which will turn into knowledge, which will turn into better results for patients. But all of those things are areas that we need to consider as we're talking about how to roll out health literacy in the program. Now, my husband actually found this, and I'm sorry it's a little fuzzy, but I thought this was a perfect cartoon to wrap up. So the one thing that I would definitely say we need to keep in mind as well as we're talking about information for people, and those of you that are experts in health literacy are wonderful. I love working with you. But remember, you guys are the parents in this thing, right? Okay, so you love what you put together, what you designed there with the little thingy for the kid to look at, but what does it look like from the kid's perspective, right? So we have to ask people what's important to them and then design things that actually fit their needs, not just what we think they need, okay? So thank you very much, I appreciate it. If you don't remember anything else, you've got clear communication of content and context. That's what people need, the 4 C's, okay? Thanks.